It was one of the most powerful engines Ford had ever built. Fast, loud, and ready to win. But suddenly, it disappeared from the spotlight. Why did Ford walk away from the 427 Camry without a fight? The untold truth might surprise you. The beginning of the battle. To begin with, the 1960s was a special time for car lovers in America. Big engines, loud sounds, and fast cars were everywhere. This time was also called the golden age of muscle cars. Everyone wanted to build the most powerful car. Ford, Chrysler, and Chevrolet were in a race to create the strongest V8 engines. These engines were not just for the streets, they were built to win on racetracks too. Next, in 1964, something happened that changed everything for Ford. At the Daytona 500, Ford's cars were easily beaten by Chrysler's new engine, the 426 HEMI. This engine was very powerful and helped Chrysler's drivers take the top 3 spots in the race. It was a big embarrassment for Ford. The company knew it had to do something fast if it wanted to stay on top in NASCAR racing. After that loss, Ford's engineers were given a tough job. They had to make a brand new engine that could beat the 426 HEMI. And they had to do it fast. Ford didn't want to lose again. So, they got to work right away. Even though they were already busy with other big racing projects like the GT40 for Le Mans and a new engine for Indy racing, they started working on this special engine. A race against time. Then came the biggest challenge: time. Ford only gave the engineers 90 days to create this new engine. That's just 3 months. It was a very short time to build something so important. But the engineers didn't give up. They used parts from an older engine called the 427 FE side oiler. This helped them save time because they didn't have to design a brand new engine from scratch. The name Camry is born. Soon, this engine got a nickname. People started calling it the Camry. This name came from the type of camshaft it used, which was different from normal engines. Even though this part made it very special, Ford never officially called it the Camry. The name just caught on with car fans, and it stayed that way. At the same time, Ford kept this project quiet. They didn't make a big public announcement. They didn't want their rivals to know what they were doing. Everything had to be done quickly and in secret. Inside the company, engineers were working day and night. They wanted to make sure this engine would help Ford win races again. Meanwhile, this fast work and secret planning showed how serious Ford was. The company knew that if they didn't respond quickly, Chrysler would continue to dominate racing. So, the Camry wasn't just another engine. It was a response to defeat. It was Ford's way of fighting back. That's why people sometimes call it the 90-day wonder. Building under pressure. In addition, building the Camry in just 90 days was very risky. Usually, building a new engine takes a lot longer, but the engineers didn't have that time. They had to work with what they had, make smart decisions, and hope everything would work. It was a big gamble, but one Ford had to take. However, the Ford 427 engine was not the first in its family. It was part of the FE series, which started in 1958. Before the 427, there were engines like the 390 and 406. The 427 came in 1963. 1963 as a stronger version, even though it really had 425 cubic inches. Ford called it a 427 to match racing rules and to compete with engines from General Motors. A strong and smart base. Next, the 427 used the same stroke as the 390, 3.78 inches, but with a larger bore of 4.23 inches. The engine had a high compression ratio of 12.5 to 1. To make it stronger, Ford used a high nickel alloy for the engine block. The block had a cloverleaf cylinder mold that was thicker than normal. It also used cross bolts for the main bearing caps and solid lifters. Later, in 1965, a forged crankshaft was added for even more durability. Improved oil system. After that, Ford made important changes to how oil flowed inside the engine. At first, the 427 had a top oiling system, but this design didn't protect the crank bearings well enough during long races. So, in 1965, Ford changed it to a side oiler system. This way, the crankshaft got oil first, and the problem was solved. Enter the Cammer. Then came the most advanced version of the 427, the Cammer. This engine, built in only 90 days, had a single overhead camshaft on each cylinder head instead of using push rods. These camshafts were driven by a very long timing chain, almost 7 feet long. It also had hemispherical combustion chambers, which gave it better airflow and made the engine breathe better. Complex chain system. Furthermore, the timing chain system was one of the Cammer's most unique parts. The long chain drove both camshafts in the same direction. Because of this, one cam turned toward the valve and the other turned away. So, Ford had to make two different camshafts, each a mirror of the other. Some racers even had to set cam timing differently on each side to fix problems caused by the chain's slack. A stronger crankshaft and engine block. Moving on, the crankshaft in the Cammer was very strong. It was made of forged steel and had extra bob weights for the new pistons. The crank was also cross-drilled. This means oil passed through holes drilled at right angles to help keep bearings lubricated at high speeds. To store oil, Ford made hollow spaces in the crank throws and sealed them with cup plugs. These became small oil reservoirs that helped keep oil cool and reduce engine heat. Additionally, the engine block for the Cammer was almost the same as the high-performance 427 pushrod block. The only real change was the rear oil drain. The main bearing caps were cross-bolted, which gave the crankshaft more support and kept it steady under pressure. New pistons and cylinder heads. Moreover, the connecting rods stayed the same, but Ford had to create new pistons. The Cammer used 3-ring forged aluminum pistons. These were shaped to match the hemichambers, with 2 flat areas cut into the tops to allow room for the intake and exhaust valves. If a valve ever floated or came loose, the flat parts would push it back into place without destroying the piston, a very clever safety feature. Continuing with the design, the Cammer's cylinder heads were fully machined. They had carefully measured combustion chambers that kept the compression high, sometimes up to 13.5 to 1. The intake and exhaust valves were placed at a 48-degree angle to avoid hitting each other. This gave the engine better airflow and less risk of damage. Smart valve design. In addition, Ford tested the valve seats and angles using airflow boxes. This helped them choose the best angles for the valves: 30 degrees for the intake and 45 degrees for the exhaust. The ports in the head were also shaped to reduce air turbulence. In fact, engineers added a small dip in the intake port wall on purpose. This helped direct the air better into the chamber, improving power and balance between the cylinders. Lightweight valves. Also, the intake and exhaust valves were both light and strong. The intake valve was 2¼ inches wide and weighed only 98 grams because it was hollow. The exhaust valve was slightly smaller at 1/61/64 inches, but weighed 99 grams. It had sodium inside the stem to help move heat away from the valve head. High-tech camshaft system. At the top of the engine, the camshafts sat inside special holders called yokes. These yokes were a line bored, so everything fit perfectly and couldn't be swapped around. The camshafts were pressure lubricated with oil, and so were the rocker arms. The rocker arms rode on needle bearings and had roller followers that touched the cam lobes. They were kept in place with spring steel spacers. In terms of maintenance, Ford had a smart way to adjust valve lash. Instead of using screws, they made thin caps of different thicknesses to place on top of the valve stems. This made adjusting easy without affecting the stem's ability to spin, which was important for even wear. Another great feature was how Ford handled camshaft timing. They used a center bolt and 4 other bolts on the cam gear, plus a small dowel. The dowel fits into one of 9 holes, allowing the cam timing to be set very precisely, within 1.5 degrees. Once the timing was set, the bolts held everything in place tightly so it wouldn't move. Dual chain drive system. Next, let's look at how the engine was driven. A smaller chain from the crankshaft turned a big gear on a stub shaft, which was in the place of a normal camshaft. This shaft also powered the oil pump and distributor. A second, much longer chain ran from that shaft to the 2 camshafts through 2 idler gears. One idler gear adjusted chain tension, and the other powered the fuel pump. To keep the stub shaft from moving, it was supported by a bearing and a machined shoulder. Lastly, the engine's front cover was made of aluminum. It had big holes for getting to the cam gear and a bearing to stop the stub shaft from moving forward. The rocker's arms were brass bushed and very light. Cam lobes were treated with a special coating to make them last longer. Well, at this stage, the intake manifold and valve springs were still being tested. Ford planned to use 2 780 cubic feet per minute Holley 4-barrel carbs for drag racing. Different spring types were being studied too, but pressure targets were already chosen: 80 pounds closed and up to 350 pounds when open. Facing problems with NASCAR. Here came the turning point in the life of this engine. After Ford created the powerful 427 SOHC engine, which many called the Cammer, they wanted to use it in NASCAR racing. However, right from the start, NASCAR had a big problem with the Cammer. They felt that the engine was too special and didn't follow the idea of stock car racing. NASCAR worried that if they allowed it, other car makers would also bring special racing engines. That could make the races unfair and too expensive for smaller teams. So, NASCAR banned the use of engines they called special racing engines. The Cammer fell into this category, which meant Ford could not use it in NASCAR races at first. Because of this rule, Ford was upset. They had put a lot of time and money into building the Cammer. It was made to be strong, fast, and better than the Hemi engines from Dodge and Plymouth. However, with the ban in place, Ford couldn't prove that their engine was better on the track. Ford's goal was to win races and show people that they made the best engines, but NASCAR's decision stopped them before they could even try. Later, NASCAR tried to offer a deal. In 1966, they said Ford could use the 427 SOHC engine, but only with big limits. First, Ford could only put the engine in large, full-size cars like the Ford Galaxy. Next, they had to use just one small 4-barrel carburetor. But the biggest problem was that the cars with the Cammer had to be very heavy. NASCAR said these cars needed to weigh 4,400 pounds. That was over 400 pounds heavier than other cars on the track, like the Dodges. As a result, Ford knew it wasn't a fair deal. They believed that adding all that extra weight would make their cars too slow. Even though the Cammer was very powerful, it couldn't win races if it was stuck in a heavy car. Because of this rule, no team wanted to race with the Cammer engine. It didn't make sense to put a fast engine in a slow car. Ford had no choice but to step away from using the Cammer in NASCAR racing. Even though NASCAR allowed it with limits, the truth is they made it too hard to use. This made it clear to Ford that NASCAR didn't really want the Cammer to be a part of the races. The rules were made in such a way that using the engine would not help Ford at all. NASCAR was protecting the Hemi engines from Dodge and Plymouth, which were already racing and winning. If Ford had used the Cammer without rules, it could have easily beaten those cars. Ford quietly dropped the 427 engine. Because of these barriers, Ford quietly pulled back. They decided not to keep fighting NASCAR over the Cammer. The engine was too good for the track, but the rules made it useless. Ford saw that they were not getting a fair chance. So, instead of trying to change NASCAR's mind again, they chose to focus on other places where the camera could shine. NASCAR had closed the door, and Ford didn't want to keep knocking. On top of that, the camera was very costly. It wasn't just about the racing rules. The engine was expensive to build and took a lot of work to make. When NASCAR wouldn't let it race without heavy limits, it didn't make sense to spend more money on it. Ford needed to use their budget in smarter ways. They wanted to win races, but not by wasting money on an engine that couldn't even be used properly. Moreover, the bad timing of the ban hurt Ford's plans. When they first made the camera in 1964, they were ready to race, but the ban came just days after they showed the engine. Then, when NASCAR finally changed the rules in 1966, it was too late. The rules were still unfair, and Ford had already lost 2 full years of racing. In the world of motorsports, 2 years is a long time. Technology moves fast, and competitors get stronger. Ford didn't want to stay stuck in the past. Because of this delay, Ford decided to move on. They no longer believed NASCAR would ever give them a fair chance. While they still wanted to win races, they now had to find new paths. They stopped pushing the camera in NASCAR and started looking at other engines that could be used without problems. This was a smart move, even though it meant leaving the camera behind. Also, Ford's efforts to keep the camera alive in NASCAR failed. They tried to talk to NASCAR, they waited through the ban, and they even looked at the rule changes in 1966. But nothing worked. Every time there was a small win, it came with a big loss. Ford could not use the engine the way it was meant to be used. In the end, all their hard work on the camera couldn't beat NASCAR's rulebook. As time went on, Ford saw better options. Other engines were easier to build, cheaper, and allowed in races. The camera was powerful, but not practical anymore. Even with all its strength and success in other types of racing, it no longer made sense for NASCAR. Ford needed to stay ahead, and that meant letting go of engines that were too difficult to use. In summary, NASCAR made it impossible for Ford to continue with the 427 SOHC. The weight handicap, the limits on the carburetor, and the high cost of building the engine all added up. Ford didn't want to waste more time or money on something that had no future in stock car racing. So, they stepped back quietly. The camera had been made to win, but the racing world didn't give it the chance. Clearly, Ford's plans were stopped, not by engine failure, but by racing politics. The camera didn't lose, it just wasn't allowed to race fairly. NASCAR's fears, the pressure from other car makers, and the tough rules ended the dream of a camera-powered NASCAR win. Ford knew that fighting against that wall was not worth it anymore. Therefore, they chose a quiet exit. They didn't make a big announcement. They just stopped pushing for the camera in NASCAR and moved on to other racing series and engine designs. It was the only option left that made sense. The camera's time in NASCAR was over before it really began. Cars powered by 427. After walking away from NASCAR, Ford didn't let the camera engine go to waste. Instead, they used it where rules were more open, drag racing. The camera became very successful in this new space. It powered fast cars like the AFX Mustangs and top fuel dragsters. In 1967, it helped racer Connie Kalitta win big. His car, called the Bounty Hunter, won the top prizes at AHRA, NHRA, and even NASCAR drag events. This made it the only Triple Crown winner in drag racing history. Other racing success. Earlier in 1966, another version of the Ford 427 engine, the side oiler, had already proven itself. It helped the famous Ford GT40 win a 1-2-3 finish at the Le Mans race. This was a huge victory for Ford and showed how powerful the 427 engines could be when used in the right way. Problems with the camera. Even though the camera was powerful, it had some problems. First, It used a very long timing chain, almost 6 feet long. This caused trouble like chain slack and problems with keeping both sides of the engine timed the same. Also, the engine's valve train design wasn't perfect. It didn't allow the engine to reach the same high power levels that modern engines could. Another issue was the engine block. Ford built the Camry by changing an older engine design called the FE block. Because of this, they had to make compromises. Things like oil passages weren't perfect, and this made the engine harder to improve. The camshafts also needed special grinding, and not many shops could do that. On top of all this, parts for the Camry were hard to find, which made repairs and builds difficult. Big and heavy. The Camry was also very large and heavy. It wasn't made for street driving. It used special pistons to create high compression in the Hemi-shaped chamber, but this made it bad for regular road use or passing emission tests. The end of the story. In the end, the Camry left behind a powerful legacy. It didn't get to race in NASCAR, but it ruled the drag strip and became a part of racing history. Even with its problems, people still remember the Camry as one of Ford's boldest engines ever made. If you enjoyed learning the untold story of Ford's powerful 427 Camry, make sure to give this video a like. Drop a comment below and tell us what you think about this legendary engine. And don't forget to subscribe for more cool car stories and hidden history.